All right, we're into learning about the last body system in this topic, and it's the endocrine system. So the key learning attention is the endocrine system releases hormones and it controls the slower responses in and outside of our body. Here are all the success criteria, so pause and take some time to read through all of these, and then you can double check them at the end of the video. So what actually is the endocrine system? Well, as an animal, one of our most important things we need to do is to be able to sense and respond to our environment. Whether it's a busy city and we're a human navigating around the city, or if we're an animal out in the wild, it's really important that we can sense our environment so that we can survive. So we need to be able to hunt and gather food, we need to communicate with other animals, we need to avoid predators, and find safe places to shelter. And so there's two main body systems that have evolved in animals to help us sense and respond. And they are the nervous system and the endocrine system. So the nervous system, as we learnt about in Year 9, it uses neurons, which are nerve cells, to send fast messages. For anything we need a fast response for. The endocrine system, which we're focusing on today, uses hormones, which are chemicals in the bloodstream, to send slower and longer lasting messages. And those messages can respond to external things outside us or the internal environment inside our body. Here are a few examples of the kind of responses and controls that the endocrine system does. So it controls how much our cells are metabolizing, so how quickly the chemical reactions are going on. It controls the growth and development of our body over many, many years. It controls our reproductive functions and our hormones to do with that, and other things like our blood sugar levels after we've eaten and between meals. So lots of important processes that the endocrine system is responsible for. Well, the structure of the endocrine system is relatively simple, but it's scattered all throughout the body. So it's made up of all these organs called glands, and they're pretty much isolated from each other. We can see in the diagram here, there's a few up near the brain, and they're basically scattered all out throughout the body. They're not joined together like the digestive system, for example. So each of these glands, the job of a gland is to produce one or more different chemicals called hormones, and then release them, and the hormones carry messages to other organs. And then we can have a response to whatever stimulus we're responding to. So we don't need to memorize all the different organs as long as we understand the generalizations that the organs in the endocrine system are glands. And we'll learn a bit more about them now. So all glands essentially have the same structure. Remember, we're always thinking of those 4 tissue types that make up every organ. And glands are made up of only a few of them. So they're made by a layer of connective tissue around the outside of the organ, which is this darker layer here. Then on the inside, there's a whole lot of glandular tissue, which is made up of epithelial tissue. Remember, normally epithelial tissue is a layer, but there's lots and lots of stacked layers inside a gland. And it's this epithelial tissue which actually secretes the hormones to send the messages. There's also a whole lot more connective tissue on the inside of a gland that makes up blood vessels, because every gland has to have heaps of blood vessels because the hormones get released into the blood and then sent around the body after that. So this example here was the adrenal gland, which releases adrenaline and a few other hormones, and it sits just above here on top of the kidney like a little hat. It's a good generic type of gland, and most glands have a similar structure. So we talked about endocrine glands, and we just learnt what they are. But there's another word called exocrine glands, and it's important to know the difference between them. Endocrine glands are obviously only in the endocrine system. These are the glands that release hormones, and they do it directly into the bloodstream. And then the bloodstream carries the hormones to whatever target cells the hormones are going to. And importantly, these glands don't have a duct. We can see over in the diagram on the right, there's a whole lot of cells that just line a capillary, a small blood vessel, and those cells release their hormone across the cell membrane straight into the capillary and into the bloodstream. So there's no large duct which collects all of the chemical. But exocrine glands do have a duct. So they still release and secrete chemicals from inside the cell, but then they release them into a duct, which is basically like an open cavity. So we can see here, there's cells lining the duct and then releasing their chemicals that they've made into the duct, and then those chemicals get released onto the surface of a different organ. And there's a couple of examples here. So for the skin, we've got a whole lot of ducts on the outer layer of our skin, and that's what our sweat glands are. So sweat glands are an exocrine gland. They make a whole lot of chemicals in our sweat, and it gets released into a duct and then out onto our skin. We also learned about the glands on the inside of our stomach and our intestines, so in our gut, and they release digestive enzymes and things like that, which we learnt about in the digestive system. And they're releasing the enzymes into a duct, and then it goes out into the stomach or out into the small intestine, which is the surface of an organ. So take some time to copy these two diagrams so you can really tell the difference between an endocrine gland in the endocrine system and a different type of gland, which are called exocrine glands. Let's look at the pancreas now, because it's a good example of an organ that's actually an endocrine and an exocrine gland at the same time. So when we learnt about the digestive system, the pancreas, we said, was part of the digestive system, and that's because it releases a whole lot of digestive enzymes to help break down our food. So in the pancreas, there are a few tissues, which are these little green ones here, and they're made up of cells that secrete the digestive enzymes. Because it's an exocrine gland, they're releasing them into a duct, which is the little green tubes along here, and then all the enzymes pass out into a larger duct and down into the top of the small intestine, the duodenum. So it's not hormones, it's definitely an exocrine gland in that way. But there's also these blue tissue types as well, and they're directly connected to blood vessels and they release hormones. So this part of the pancreas is definitely part of the endocrine system, and we can also say it's an endocrine gland. It releases insulin and glucagon. They're hormones that help to regulate our blood sugar levels, and we'll learn more about them in the next topic. So those cells are releasing the hormones directly into the bloodstream, and they're going off to send their messages to wherever they need to go. All right, let's learn a bit more about hormones and how they actually work. So we've already said that they're secreted by endocrine glands directly into the blood. The key with hormones is they only target specific cells. And the cells that they target are going to have particular receptors for that hormone. And a receptor is just one of the membrane proteins that we learnt about in the cell membrane topic. So there's going to be the cell membrane for the cell, and then that cell is either going to have an integral or a peripheral protein in the plasma membrane, and that's going to be able to attach to the hormone, and then it will carry the message into the cell somehow and cause the response. So hormones are chemical messengers. They carry information to other cells, producing a response. They only need to be released in tiny amounts from a gland. So only a few parts per million in our blood is enough to cause a huge response in our body. As I mentioned, they get transported through the bloodstream to receptor molecules on what we call the target cell. And if a cell doesn't have the receptor, then it's not going to be affected by the hormone, so it's not a target cell. You need to have the receptor. Once the hormone hits the cell changes what it's doing, and that's what causes the actual response. All right. So the endocrine system does have a few key organs that help to control it, because the endocrine and the nervous system are really closely related, and they work together to respond to stimuli and to maintain the internal balance in our body, which is called homeostasis, keeping things level and even so our cells are in a stable environment. That's the topic of our next chapter as well. The hypothalamus is another key organ that controls the endocrine system. So it's this green tissue in the lower part of the brain, and it's really responsible for linking the nervous system to the endocrine system. And it helps to control all the other endocrine system organs by sending messages to the pituitary gland, which is this tiny little section of the brain. It basically sticks off at the front of our brain behind our eyes, and it receives messages from the hypothalamus, and then it sends messages to the other glands, and they go and do the response that they need to. Okay, there's two main categories of hormones that get released from glands, so we'll need to learn the differences and how they work, because they act a little bit differently on their target cell. The first group of hormones are called steroid hormones. They're based on cholesterol molecules, which are found in the plasma membrane, thinking back to our first topic. So because of their chemistry, they are hydrophobic. They're lipid soluble. And remember, any molecule that's hydrophobic can easily pass through the cell membrane using simple diffusion, just like we can see here. So when these hormones come along to their target cell, they can just diffuse straight through the membrane and then get into the cytoplasm, and then they bind to a receptor inside the cytoplasm, which we can see here. So it diffuses across the cell membrane using simple diffusion. Here's a receptor that fits the hormone, and the hormone attaches to the receptor, and then the message is carried to the rest of the cell, and the cell changes whatever function it needs to. Some common steroid hormones are testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone, which are all related to sexual development and sexual reproduction, and cortisol, which is one of our stress response hormones. The other main category of hormones are based on proteins, because they're made of protein. Remember that proteins are built up of amino acids, which make up the molecule. Proteins are hydrophilic, and they're also large, so they definitely can't diffuse across the plasma membrane. So these are the hormones that are going to attach to a receptor that's on the outside of the cell. So like we mentioned earlier, this is going to be one of those membrane proteins. It might be peripheral or it might be integral. It might be integral in the cell. So once the hormone comes along, it binds to that membrane protein, and then that protein causes some other cascade of a whole lot of other functions, and that sends the message inside the cell. It's often quite complicated how the message gets sent on. So some key protein hormones are insulin and glucagon that control our blood sugar level, and our thyroid hormones, which control our growth and a few other things. So to finish up, let's just have a look at an example of a whole endocrine response from start to finish. So this one's adrenaline. We all probably know that adrenaline causes the fight, flight, and freeze response. And here's a little situation. So we don't have many big predators in Australia, but if you're on a hike in the Northern Hemisphere, particularly in America, you might see a huge predator like this grizzly bear here. And you're going to get a big shot of adrenaline in your body that's going to cause a whole lot of changes. So the first step is going to be your nervous system actually senses the stimulus to begin with. After that, the brain's going to send the message down to the hypothalamus. Remember, the hypothalamus controls the rest of the endocrine system. Then the hypothalamus uses its nerves, which are connected to the spinal cord and then directly to the adrenal glands, to activate the adrenal glands. If you're doing psychology, these nerves are all part of the autonomic nervous system, which we don't control. And adrenaline is an excitatory function. It increases things, so it's also part of the sympathetic nervous system. So it activates the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are a gland, and their job is to release a hormone, and that's our adrenaline, which gets released into the bloodstream. And adrenaline actually acts on a whole lot of different target cells. So it acts on the muscles in the heart to increase our heart rate. It's also going to act on our liver to release more glucose into our blood so we have more energy. It acts on our digestive system cells to slow digestion so we don't get cramps and we don't waste energy. It also acts on every blood vessel in the body to increase our blood pressure. And it dilates the airways in our lungs so we can get more oxygen in case we need to run or fight, whatever we're responding to. So hopefully after adrenaline's released, you're either going to fight the bear, you're going to run away, or you might freeze in the hope that you survive. Freeze is generally the worst option when you have this response, but a lot of the time it's not up to us to control. All right, so that's an example of a whole endocrine response from start to finish. So have a pause, double check all your success criteria. If you've got any questions, bring them into class and we'll have a talk about them in our discussion.